Good. Sobering words, aren't they? I'm wondering why I'm smiling coming up here. But we're going to explore Lamentations chapter 1. Just before we do, it's great to be back here. I was talking to Craig and Janet just before the service when we arrived, and I think it was about 3 years ago that I was here at Maida. But my history with Maida goes back a long time, because some of you might remember Simon and Julie Jennings, who were in ministry here many years ago, and with Nick Renson back in those days. And so over the years we've sort of come at different times, and it's lovely to be here again, and very thankful for Craig's invitation to come and share with you this morning. For those of you who don't know me, as was mentioned, I'm at the college. We're now Moreland College because we merged. Some of you would have heard of that at the beginning of this year. So we were Vale Seminary, Baptist Theological College of WA. But we're functioning as we have always functioned, and we have quite a few students. We've had a lot of new students come beginning of this year and continuing on. I'm actually not there at the moment because I'm on study leave. So that means that I've got 6 months to do some research, some writing, and I'm actually doing a course myself as well. So I'm not actually on site at the college, but just a bit of an advertisement. If you are interested in thinking about theological studies, then there are opportunities there, and we have lots of different ways in which you can study these days. You don't have to come to lectures, you can study online, and there are different options. So I'd really encourage you to have a chat to me afterwards if you would like to, but also you can drop into the college or go to the website and have a look at what's available. There are some really great opportunities there. Well, I can't say no one's too young to study, because we don't tend to have students who are at school, but I can say no one's too old to study, because we have a lot of students who are well into their senior years. I think our oldest student from memory would have been in their early 80s, I think, when they began. Sort of got to retirement and then decided that they wanted to take up some serious theological studies. So the options are there, and I always say to people, well, often we're our own worst enemy. We kind of say, oh, I don't think I could do that, I don't think I could manage it. It's amazing what people can actually achieve when they set their mind to it and when they set their heart to it. And if God's calling you to it, then that, it's a whole other dimension. So the opportunity is there. But I'm here to speak to you this morning from Lamentations, and Craig said to me, sometimes when I go to churches, the church says, well, just talk about what you'd like to talk about. But in this case, Craig said that you're doing a series on it's okay to be not okay. It's okay to be not okay. And I've actually entitled my message this morning, When the Sadness Seems Too Much to Bear. I want to focus on that topic. And as we had heard those words from Lamentations chapter 1, I think you would have got a sense, whoever was writing this, that their sadness was almost too much to bear. They were deeply saddened, deeply traumatised by what had taken place. I feel privileged, especially in these times of COVID-19, to be living in a place like Western Australia. We're pretty safe, aren't we? And Australia generally. I know there are some pretty significant issues in New South Wales, particularly in Victoria and now Queensland, but generally speaking, Australia has done really well. I was born in Perth, grew up in Perth. Some people say I'm too parochial, I love this place too much. I've had the opportunity to travel to many places in the world and see some wonderful things, as I'm sure many of you have too. But I always love coming back home. I love this place, and not just for its safety, but I just think it's a wonderful place to live. But of course, it's not perfect. I now live in East Perth. I've lived there for about 5 years. And I spend a fair bit of time in the city centre, doing my shopping and my personal business and so on and so forth. And I don't know how many of you have been to the city centre recently, but it's very depressing. It's actually really concerning. And sometimes I feel like the title of my message, when I go out my front door and go into the city, I feel like the sadness that I feel is almost too much to bear. I love the place where I live, but it is a very sad place. I walk the streets of the CBD, and some of you will recognise this. I see a lot of people who are homeless. I see an enormous amount of mental illness, some very, very severe, which concerns me greatly. I see a lot of derelict shops. shops that were once filled with goods and services and people and life and vibrancy. And I really do worry for our city centre. I've been to a lot of community meetings where various ideas have been talked about as to how we can address these kinds of issues. And some of those things have been done, but I still worry. What was once a city full of life has become in parts almost a desert. It's devoid of life and character. And I lament those things every time I go into the city. The sadness seems almost too much to bear. Now maybe you think I'm being melodramatic, and maybe you haven't been into the city and you don't really particularly want to go into the city, but that's just my impression and my feeling as I venture into that place. The sadness is tangible every time I walk out the door. You know, I feel for the people who are struggling. I feel for the helplessness that some of them experience on the streets. I'm at least glad to be part of Perth Baptist Church, and if you know where Perth Baptist Church is, we're right in the centre of Northbridge, and our church is doing as much as it can to address some of these issues and to help people who are desperately in need. But sadness is still there. And you might be wondering, well, what's that got to do with us in this room today and Lamentations chapter 1 that we read earlier? Well, quite simply, the person who wrote this book was, I think, in a situation where the sadness they were experiencing probably seemed too much to bear. I think it's fairly obvious from what we read earlier today. And I want to explore that briefly with you. What can we do as people of faith when sadness in life confronts us? Whether it's me lamenting the problems that I see in the city, or whether it's one of us lamenting a personal tragedy that we've been through, or whether it's your church that is saddened by something that happens in your community. What do we do with those situations? How do we deal with them as Christians, as people of faith? Lamentations is a really dramatic example of trauma and tragedy. You're probably aware that traditionally scholars say that Jeremiah probably wrote Lamentations. And that makes sense because Jeremiah was a prophet at the time when Jerusalem fell, and he would have been probably an eyewitness to the things that are described in the book of Lamentations. Jerusalem was destroyed in the 6th century BC, 600 years before the time of Christ. Babylonians came down from the north, a very powerful enemy, and destroyed the city and carted off all of the people into slavery. If it wasn't Jeremiah, well, it was certainly someone who'd seen what happened, because the description is very graphic. And you can understand why these people were devastated. These people were losing their city, their temple where they worshipped God. You know, that's like someone coming along before you arrive here on Sunday morning and just decimating your church building. And you turn up on Sunday to worship God and it's gone. It's in rubble. That's the kind of thing that they were experiencing. And then, as I said, being taken off into exile as well. You might wonder, well, what does Lamentations chapter 1 tell us about coping with sadness and grief and trauma? I think it says a lot, and I want to explore that with you this morning. Sometimes people say, when you experience grief and trauma and sadness in life, you know, kind of just brush yourself off, get up and keep going. Have faith in God, walk forward, don't look back, and it'll all be okay. You've probably heard those kinds of words or those sort of thoughts and feelings at different times. Isn't that what people of faith ought to do? You know, we just trust in God and move on. Well, to answer these questions, I want to look at how Jews historically have coped with sadness and grief. And we're going to look at Lamentations chapter 1 in that regard. Then I want to talk a bit about how Jesus coped with sadness and grief. What did he do when the feelings of sadness seemed overwhelming? And finally, I want to make some suggestions about how we might respond to situations where things are not okay. But the overwhelming theme that I want to present to you is that when we feel sad, when we feel traumatised, when we feel grief, you know, it's okay to be not okay at times. And we need to allow people the space to be not okay. So what about Lamentations and the Jewish people? Well, it's coincidental that about 2 weeks ago, there was a major Jewish festival, which is held every year. It's the festival of Tisha B'Av, which literally means the 9th of Av. Av is a month of the year for Jewish people. And every year, this is one of the 5 major festivals that they celebrate. And it's an interesting festival because it's actually a festival of grief. I know that sounds a bit strange. You probably think of festivals as being joyous, happy times, where we celebrate good things, but this is actually a festival of grief. And it's a remembrance of 2 things in particular. It's a remembrance of when the temple was destroyed during the time when Lamentations was written. As I said to you earlier, Jerusalem was destroyed, the temple was destroyed. And then you might remember that when they came back from captivity many, many years later, they built another temple, the second temple. And that temple was destroyed in 70 AD, about 30 or 40 years after Jesus died. So they actually had 2 temples in their history that were destroyed by foreign forces. The first time by the Babylonians, in 70 AD it was by the Romans. So for these people, for these Jewish people, this was their church. Now, it's not like us these days where we could say, well, okay, I'd be really devastated if this building was destroyed, but hey, there's a few other churches that I could go to. But for ancient Jewish people, that wasn't the case. If your temple was destroyed, you had no church. You had nowhere where you could worship God. So this festival, if we call it that, that's what Jewish people call it, a festival. It's not a festival that celebrates something, it's a festival that remembers the sadness, grief, the trauma of what it was like when those temples were destroyed. What's interesting to me is that Jewish people, even today, don't deny or ignore when they're not feeling okay. When they're remembering sad events of the past, or even sad events of the present, they don't pretend it's okay. They don't deny that it ever happened. They don't ignore it. They actually embrace it. If I can put it this way, many of my Jewish friends would say it's a good thing to express your grief and acknowledge your grief. It's a good thing to be able to say, you know what, we're not okay. This is a difficult time. This is a traumatic time. If you move outside Lamentations, many of you will know that the Psalms are full of poems and songs where the psalmist and the community expresses its grief and its sadness. The psalmist is often talking to God about the fact that they're not okay. An interesting thing is that neither in Lamentations nor in Psalms is there anywhere where it says, shouldn't do that. That's not a good thing. In fact, the book of Lamentations and Psalms does quite the opposite. It encourages us to express our feelings when we're not okay. Let's look at a couple of examples from Lamentations chapter 1. Verse 1, it says that there's loneliness like a widow. That's a really deep feeling, like one who has lost the closest one to them that they love. And they're grieving over that. Verse 2, it says, bitterly weeping and no one to comfort. I don't know if you've ever experienced that, but that's probably one of the worst experiences, when you're not okay and you're in deep sadness and grief and there's no one to comfort you. Verse 3, pursuers have overtaken in the midst of her distress. So it's not just a sadness that's internal, but here in this situation there are people coming in and destroying the temple and destroying the city. Threatened, physically threatened. Verse 4, the roads to Zion mourn and the gates are desolate. Now, of course, this is all imagery of the city, because the city is, the city itself doesn't feel, but it's a picture of what the people of the city were feeling at this time. And the list goes on. We could go through all of the images there in those first 16 verses and even beyond. But in verse 16, it finishes the section we finished this morning by saying, "For these things I weep and my eyes flow with tears. For a comforter is far from me, one to revive my courage. My children are desolate, for the enemy has prevailed." And you know what? When I read Lamentations, I don't hear the voice of God saying, "No, no, no, don't do that. Be happy. It's okay. It'll be fine." I don't hear that. I just hear the voice of the person who's recounting what they're seeing and expressing their sadness. It's okay to be not okay. And this is a great example of that. This is a person of faith, not a person of no faith. You know, you might say, well, maybe a person who doesn't have faith in God, who doesn't trust in God, maybe they react differently. But this is a person who trusts in God. The Jewish people of Jeremiah's day seemed convinced that nothing bad could happen to them, but now it has. And Lamentations opens this long poem, and when you've got time, if you haven't already, read through the whole book of Lamentations. It's not an easy read. You probably got that idea from the first chapter. It's pretty tough going. But read through it and just try to begin to feel how these people might have felt. It's important to notice here, as I said, that there's nothing in Lamentations or the rest of the book that suggests that these feelings should not be expressed. And as I said earlier, the ongoing festival of Tisha B'Av for the Jewish people is a recognition of that. Also, and some of you may have participated in a Passover service, a Passover Seder during Easter time, and it's the same at Passover. There is sadness that's expressed in that context as well. It was okay to be not okay when faced with the destruction of their city and the removal from their land. If we had time to look at the Psalms, we could look at some examples there as well. But when the psalmist complains, when the psalmist is overwhelmed with sadness, again, there's nothing to suggest that they shouldn't express that. And some of you might be thinking, well, maybe that was okay for the Jews to be okay to be not okay and to talk about it. But didn't Jesus have a different view? I mean, didn't he think differently about these things? He didn't express sadness or despair, did he? Well, let's remember, first of all, that the Bible that Jesus read was the Old Testament, which contains the Psalms and Lamentations. So Jesus was very familiar with his tradition. He was very familiar with this practice of Jewish people recognising and acknowledging their sadness. But we also have a few specific examples and instances where Jesus expressed his own sadness and trauma openly and without excuse. You might remember the story of Jesus and Lazarus. And it's a really interesting story. Lazarus was a person who Jesus knew well and who Jesus loved. And Lazarus died. In fact, he was so dead that he was in the grave for quite a few days. And Jesus' friends called Jesus and said, Lazarus has died. So Jesus goes to the tomb. And for those of you who know the story, you know the end of the story is that Jesus calls Lazarus forth. And he comes alive again. He was a bit smelly, and he had grave clothes wrapped around him, but he was alive. That's better than being dead. But there's a bit in the middle of the story that we sometimes forget. And Jesus turned up to the tomb of Lazarus. And what's the first thing that he does before he calls Lazarus forth? Can you remember? It's actually the shortest verse in the Bible.
He wept.
Yeah. John 11:35. Jesus wept. Now, what's going on there? I mean, Jesus comes to the tomb of Lazarus. I presume he knows that he's going to call Lazarus forth and Lazarus is going to come back to life. That's a good thing. And yet he pauses and he cries. Well, I don't know because I can't get into the mind of Jesus, but one of the things that I wonder is whether he was acknowledging that death is a terribly sad thing. And even though he knew that he was going to call Lazarus back to life, Jesus also was acknowledging in his tears that death was not something that God desired for people. Because God's God of life, not a God of death. God's a God of resurrection. There's another instance in Luke 19. It's quite different. Jesus is on a hill and he's looking over the city of Jerusalem. And the story tells us again that as Jesus looked at the city of Jerusalem, he felt so sad for the people in that city because they'd rejected his message. They effectively rejected God. And the story tells us in Luke 19 that Jesus wept again. He cried for the city of Jerusalem. It seems to me that in both those instances, the feelings of sadness that Jesus had seemed almost too great to bear. And he expressed that through his tears. The third example is a very dramatic one. Jesus is hanging on the cross at the end of his life. He's dying. And he says a number of things during that period of time. But one thing he does say is he quotes Psalm 22 at one point, and he says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Now that's an expression of deep sadness, grief, trauma, distress. There are lots of words we could put to that. Jesus is physically distressed. Jesus is spiritually distressed. Jesus knows that he's going to die. And he cries out with this question that really can't be answered. There's no answer to that question. But it seems to me, at least from those three examples, and there are others as well, but it seems to me that there were times in Jesus' life where he was okay to be not okay and to express that in quite graphic ways, to cry out with a question of despair and distress. He expressed it openly and he expressed it clearly. You know, in the first few centuries of the church, after the life of Jesus, maybe it may seem strange to you, but one of the things they struggled with was the idea that Jesus was really human. They could kind of accept the idea that he was the Son of God, but they struggled with his humanity. But these kinds of stories in the Gospels remind us that Jesus was fully human, just like you and me. And that when he was confronted with things that were sad or things that distressed him, he responded like any ordinary human being. He was saddened. He cried. He asked questions. He prayed. He had all of the same reactions that we might have. We don't see Jesus at Lazarus' tomb saying, "Don't be sad, I'm going to raise him from the dead in a few moments." No, Jesus wept. We don't see Jesus looking over Jerusalem at the people who had rejected him and rejected God and saying, "Don't worry, God will fix it up, it'll be fine." No, Jesus wept. We don't see Jesus hanging on the cross saying to everyone around him, "Don't worry, 3 days' time I'm going to be raised from the dead, it'll all be fine, God's in control and God will fix it up." At that point we see Jesus crying out with this heartfelt question, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And so I think if we're called as Christians to be followers of Christ, if Christ is our example, then we must take these kinds of examples into account. He was not one to dismiss the deep emotions of sadness produced by trauma. He acknowledged them and expressed them, just like the writer of Lamentations 1. I think these examples remind us that it's okay to be not okay. We don't want to be not okay all the time, but when there are those times when we're not okay, it's all right for us to have those feelings and to express those feelings. So what does Lamentations say about us or say to us? Does this chapter have anything to say when things are not okay for us, for you and me? Well, I think it does have some important things to say. Firstly, Lamentations, as I said, is the beginning of a long poem which records the people of Israel's lament for the destruction of their city, the loss of their land and their temple. It was sadness for them that seemed too much to bear. It was not just one person's feelings, but it was the experience of the whole community. And this reminds us that sometimes sadness is not just about me, it's not just about you, it's actually about us. And I'm a firm believer that as the church, we need to be communities that can grieve together. We need to be communities that can express our sadness with one another. And sometimes those things will be things that will affect the whole of us. I'm not familiar with the mission in India that you support, but we've heard a story this morning where a significant figure has died, and I'm sure many of you were here at the time when they came to this church. And that's an opportunity, that's an example of where this community can share that grief together, that sadness. Lamentations and Psalms, as I mentioned, demonstrate to us that when this kind of thing happens, the sadness we feel, which may feel overwhelming, can be expressed in a poem. And I don't know about you, different people express their grief in different ways. I'm a musician, so for me, sometimes my expression of grief comes out through music. Some of you might be artists, you might paint, you might write poetry, you might journal. There are all sorts of different ways in which we can express our grief. But I think Lamentations models to us, this is in the form of a poem or a song, but Lamentations models to us that it's really important for us to find a way of externalising the way that we're feeling, to be able to express it. Jewish people do this every year, like I said, at the festival of Tisha B'Av. They have a culture which is willing to express their sadness and their trauma. I would say, and some of you know that I have a Jewish heritage, my father was Jewish, and my experience of the Jewish community would suggest to me that the one event in their history that they would want to forget completely is the Holocaust. In fact, they don't even call it the Holocaust any longer. They call it Shoah, which is a Hebrew word which means disaster. And there are reasons for that which I won't go into. But it's interesting that Jewish people don't ignore or deny or put to one side the Holocaust. They actually have a day of the year, every year again, where they remember the tragedy that was for the Jewish people. I think sometimes as Christians we miss that. Sometimes as Christians we, for whatever reason, feel that we should just ignore the difficulties, the trials, the traumas, the sadness, the grief, the trauma, and just trust in God. But I think in this case the Jewish people have something of value to model to us. As I said, if we as Christians believe that Jesus is our ultimate example of how to live life well, when he was sad, when he was traumatised, he expressed his sadness, sometimes in tears, sometimes in prayer, but he expressed it. He didn't hold it in, he didn't ignore it, and he didn't deny it. Why is this so important? Why am I talking about this? Many years ago I was in pastoral ministry in a number of different churches, and I grew up in the church as well, and I guess as I reflect on those years, one of the things that has saddened me is that sometimes we as Christians are not open to express the sadness that we have. We're not open to say to people around us, you know, I'm not okay. I'm really doing it tough at the moment. I'm really struggling. We, for some reason, seem to want to cover it up. And I don't think that's necessarily a good thing. We all suffer sadness and trauma at different times. Some more than others. I don't know about you, but I certainly encounter people in my life and who seem to suffer inordinate amounts of sadness. You know, it's just one thing after another. But if we're not that kind of person, there's certainly times in our life when we do experience these terrible things. And as I said, I've noticed there's a tendency in the church for people to say, trust in God, God's in control, it'll all be okay, just get on with life. Well, yeah, trusting God is important. God is in control of things? Yes. We might agree with those things, but there's still a place for us to express how we're feeling. At best, when we say those sort of things to people, oh, just, get on with life, I think it's disrespectful of a person's feelings. I think it's unhelpful, and at worst, it can actually damage the person. And when we don't express the sadness and the struggles that we have, push it down inside, it doesn't stay there. It goes somewhere. Sometimes it's externalised. We get angry with people, get frustrated with people. Sometimes people get violent. Or it does go inside and it ends up being depression. And that can be a very serious mental health issue. So we need to be very, very careful that we don't bottle these things up inside. Life for all of us seems too much to bear at times. And it's important for us to admit, for our own good, to those around us, the way that we feel. Saying to ourselves and saying to one another, it's okay to be not okay sometimes. I'm sure there are those of you sitting here today who have experienced things that have seemed too much to bear in your life. Maybe there are people sitting in this room this morning who are going through that experience right now. You've experienced a loss in your family, a loss of a job, or something else has happened in your life, and you're sitting there saying to me, yeah, it seems almost too much to bear, and I'm really struggling. Well, I encourage you to express how you're feeling, first of all, to God. God will not judge. God will not shut you down and say, no, you can't say that. God wants us to be honest. Secondly, I'd encourage you to find people around you who you can trust. Not people who are going to shut you down, so don't feel like that. But people who are prepared to listen to you, to put an arm around you, to give you a hug, to sit there while you cry, to pray for you, to encourage you. There's no shame in that. There's no shame in asking for support. There's no shame for expressing your needs to one another. That's part of what the church is about. We are there for each other. God hears your prayer because God is a God of comfort. And I can't think of any better words to finish this morning than words that come from 2 Corinthians chapter 1. 2 Corinthians is an interesting letter. It's one of the letters that Paul wrote to the church at Corinth. And in that letter, he talks a lot about the distress that he feels. Now, I don't know about you, but, Paul is one of those heroes of the faith. And, we can imagine that he was always strong and resilient. But in 2 Corinthians, he talks about his weaknesses and his struggles. But it's interesting because at the very beginning of that letter, chapter 1, he says this, and I'd like to close with these words this morning before I pray. He says, "Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort that we ourselves have received from God." Isn't that beautiful? I'm going to read those words again. I just think that's so profound. Praise be to God, the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort that we ourselves have received from God. As I thought about the topic that Craig gave me a few weeks ago and thought about what I felt God wanted me to say this morning, I think for me these words sum it up. I want to say to you, God is there for you, and God is there for you so that you can be there for each other. That's really a simple way of saying what Paul here is saying in Corinthians. Let me pray as we close this morning. Loving God, we thank you that you are a God of compassion, a God of comfort. And I pray this morning that as we have spoken of this difficult topic, there are those in this place this morning who, maybe in years gone by, maybe decades gone by, have experienced sadness that has seemed too much to bear. I pray that at those times there would have been the opportunity for them to express that to you, and that they would have had people around them to comfort them. But if that's not the case, then I pray this morning that this would be an opportunity for people who've experienced these difficult things to express them to you and to find people around them to support them and pray for them. And if there are those in this place who right now are going through these very difficult times, may they know you as a God of comfort, and may they also be able to express their sadness, to be able to say to those around them, I'm not okay. And for this community to be the kind of church community that supports people in their situation of feeling not okay, that encourages them with comfort and prayer, that encourages them to look to you, but that doesn't try to shut down their feelings or to encourage them to ignore the way that they're feeling. So we thank you for the way that you comfort us. We thank you for the opportunity we have to comfort one another. And I really pray that this community would be one where people are there for one another in good times, but also particularly in the difficult times. I pray these things in Christ's name. Amen. I think we're going